A helpless alien mother leaves her baby at a human's door. But he welcomes them both. It was a cold, brittle night when Daniel Reed first heard the knock that would change his life forever. A knock so soft and tentative that at first he thought it was just the creaking of the old sycamore branches against the side of his house, the same sounds he had grown accustomed to ignoring during his years living alone at the edge of Fairview Woods. But something about that night felt different, as if the very air was holding its breath. Daniel was halfway through a lukewarm cup of coffee, flipping absent-mindedly through a mechanic's journal he had read a dozen times before, when the sound came again, a tap, 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 so faint that he almost convinced himself it was his imagination. But some instinct rooted deep inside him, a tug that had nothing to do with logic, pulled him toward the front door. He set down his coffee, pulled on a sweatshirt, and padded silently across the wooden floors, pausing for a moment at the peephole. Nothing. Just the familiar fog rolling in from the woods, turning his porch into a floating island adrift in mist. But still that feeling persisted, an itch at the back of his mind that something, someone, was out there, waiting. Daniel unlocked the door, the deadbolt clicking loudly in the silent house, and pulled it open. The cold hit him first, a sharp bite that made him flinch, but then his eyes dropped downward and his breath caught in his throat. There, nestled in a bundle of what looked like soft metallic fabric that shimmered faintly in the porch light, was a baby. Not just any baby. Its skin was a silvery hue, almost translucent, and the small, delicate face was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen, the features both familiar and profoundly alien at once. Tiny hands curled instinctively toward warmth, and with a soft whimper, the infant shifted within its wrappings. Next to the baby was a small object, no bigger than a coin, glowing with a gentle, pulsing blue light. Stunned, Daniel crouched down, slowly, reaching out with shaking hands, half expecting the image to vanish like some cruel trick of light and loneliness. But the baby was real, solid and breathing, radiating a fragile warmth. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who had left this child? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? A scientific experiment gone wrong? But before he could even begin to formulate a coherent thought, movement at the edge of his vision drew his gaze beyond the porch, into the swirling mist that blanketed the woods. There, just beyond the reach of the porch light, stood a figure. A woman, or something. Close to one, swaying unsteadily, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. Her skin, like the baby's, shimmered with that same pale silver hue, and her hair, long and tangled, caught the faint light with a ghostly glimmer. Their eyes met for a single breathless moment, hers wide and luminous, filled with a sorrow, so deep and raw that it felt almost sacred, and in that look, Daniel understood. She wasn't here to hurt anyone. She wasn't an invader or a threat. She was a mother, and she was desperate. With the last remnants of her strength, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. "Please, protect her." Then, without a sound, she turned and disappeared into the mist, swallowed whole by the night as if she had never been there at all. Daniel knelt there, frozen, the baby cradled awkwardly in his arms, the weight of the moment, crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He should call someone, he thought. The authorities, an ambulance, maybe even the military, surely someone more qualified to deal with whatever this was. Yet even as the thought formed, he knew he wouldn't do any of it. Looking down at the baby's peaceful face, he felt something stir in him, something fierce and primal and utterly undeniable. It didn't matter that she wasn't human. It didn't matter that he didn't understand. What mattered was that she had been entrusted to him, and he would not fail her. Shivering from more than just the cold, Daniel rose to his feet, cradling the baby close to his chest. He kicked the door shut behind him and bolted it, as if trying to seal out the strange and terrifying world that had just intruded upon his carefully ordered life. Moving almost on autopilot, he grabbed a blanket from the couch and wrapped it more securely around the baby, who responded by letting out a soft, contented sigh. Daniel sat down heavily in the recliner, heart still hammering in his chest, and tried to think. He needed supplies, formula, diapers, blankets, But how could he explain this child to anyone? Even if by some miracle no one noticed the shimmering skin, the pendant beside her seemed dangerously advanced, a piece of technology that clearly didn't belong on Earth. Daniel picked it up carefully, examining it. It was smooth and warm to the touch, almost alive, and as he turned it over in his hand, it projected a soft, holographic image above it. A sigil, beautiful and alien, and a series of symbols that looked like language but made no sense to him. For a moment, he thought he heard something. A voice, soft and melodic, speaking words he couldn't understand but somehow felt he almost recognized, like a dream slipping through his fingers. Gently he set the device down beside the baby and leaned back, closing his eyes, trying to slow the hurricane of thoughts spinning inside his head. What had he gotten himself into? Whatever happened next, one thing was clear. There was no turning back. Morning came slowly, a sluggish gray light seeping through the curtains. Daniel hadn't slept, too afraid to close his eyes, worried that the baby might vanish, or that some shadowy government agency might storm through his door demanding answers. But none of that happened. Instead, he spent the long, aching hours memorizing every detail of the child, how her small chest rose and fell with each breath, how her tiny fingers curled reflexively around the fabric of his hoodie, how the faint pulse of light from the pendant beside her seemed to sync with her heartbeat. At one point, when she stirred and whimpered, he sang to her softly, old lullabies he barely remembered from his own childhood, and to his amazement, she calmed, her small body relaxing against him in trust. That simple act nearly undid him. When dawn finally broke, Daniel stood carefully, carrying the sleeping child upstairs to the spare bedroom he used mostly for storage. He cleared out boxes and old computer parts, creating a makeshift crib out of an old laundry basket lined with blankets. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he placed her down gently, he caught sight of his reflection in the dusty mirror propped against the wall, a man with rumpled hair, bloodshot eyes, and an expression he barely recognized. He looked terrified. And yet, beneath that fear, something else burned brighter: determination. He had made a choice. No matter how impossible the situation seemed, no matter what dangers might come, he would protect this child. She was his responsibility now. Maybe fate had picked the wrong man. Maybe he would fail. But he would fail trying. In the days that followed, Daniel moved carefully, methodically. He ordered supplies online, using cash-loaded gift cards to avoid drawing attention. He spent sleepless nights studying the pendant, experimenting with different materials and frequencies, trying to understand how it worked. Gradually, he pieced together fragments, images of a world with twin suns, cities of crystal and light, oceans that shimmered with colors Earth had no names for. He saw glimpses of a proud people, wise and peaceful, torn apart by conflict they hadn't sought. And he saw the woman, the mother, cradling her child with infinite tenderness before sealing her into a small, shining pod and sending her hurtling across the void to safety. Daniel didn't know her name. He didn't know her story in full. But he knew her heart, and he promised, silently, fiercely, that her sacrifice would not be in vain. Little by little, a routine emerged. Feedings, diaper changes, baths, mundane tasks made magical by the strangeness of his new reality. The baby, whom he had started calling Luma for the faint glow of her skin under moonlight, responded to him with bright, curious eyes and gurgling coos. She was, in every way that mattered, a normal infant, hungry, fussy, needy, and utterly, heartbreakingly dependent. And Daniel loved her more with each passing hour. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if others would come looking for her, if the beings who had destroyed her home might one day appear on his doorstep, demanding her return. But for now, in the fragile, precious stillness of that first strange dawn, Daniel allowed himself to believe that he could protect her, that maybe, just maybe, love could bridge the distance between worlds. And so, as the first light of morning broke fully over Fairview Woods, Daniel Reed sat quietly beside the makeshift crib, one hand resting protectively on its edge, and watched over the sleeping child who had fallen into his life like a star plummeting from the heavens. Fragile, beautiful, and impossibly, wonderfully real. Daniel Reed had always prided himself on being a man of reason, a fixer of things that could be logically dismantled and reassembled, a solver of problems rooted firmly in the concrete laws of physics and machinery. But the tiny, silver-skinned infant asleep in his spare room defied every rational framework he had ever relied upon. And the longer he cared for her, the more he realized that logic alone was useless now, and something deeper, something more primal, had to guide him. He had named her Luma, after the soft, almost imperceptible glow that her skin sometimes emitted when she was dreaming, a faint radiance that bathed the little room in a gentle silver light and made her seem less like a being of flesh and more like a fragment of the stars themselves. Each day was a slow learning curve, a tightrope walk between panic and determination. Daniel spent endless hours scouring the internet for information on infant care, diapers, feeding schedules, how to soothe colic, while simultaneously trying to interpret the strange signals emanating from the pendant she had been left with, the device that seemed equal parts translator, monitor, and communication relic. Feeding Luma was the first major hurdle. Human formulas made her sick almost immediately, her small body rejecting them with a shudder that left Daniel in despair until, by some miracle, the pendant projected a soft, shimmering image of a molecular structure unlike any formula he had ever seen. And after several tense experiments mixing goat's milk, specific vitamins, and a few rare minerals bought discreetly online, he managed to concoct something that the little girl could digest without distress. The relief he felt when her cries turned to contented sighs after a feeding was overwhelming, an emotional landslide that left him sitting on the nursery floor with tears in his eyes, clutching her tiny hand as if anchoring himself to some new, fragile purpose. He found himself talking to her constantly, narrating every little action. "Okay, Luma, time to change your diaper, even though we both hate it." Or, "Let's see if Daddy can cook something edible tonight." The words slipping out so naturally. "Daddy!" that he froze the first time it left his mouth, stunned by the weight and truth of it. He wasn't just babysitting. He wasn't just harboring some alien orphan until someone came to collect her. He was raising her, claiming her, choosing her, and the realization hit him harder than anything else had, harder even than the night he found her. Nights were the hardest. Once Luma was asleep, Daniel would sit in the darkened living room, the soft glow of the baby monitor, rigged with extra sensors he had built to detect any unusual readings, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And he would think about the woman in the woods, about her haunted golden eyes, about the impossible sadness that had radiated from her as she placed her trust, her very heart, in the hands of a stranger. Where was she now? Dead, perhaps, her fragile body unable to survive Earth's atmosphere? Or hiding, watching from the woods, too afraid to come closer, yet unable to leave altogether? The questions gnawed at him, but he forced them down, focusing instead on the immediate, tangible needs of the child entrusted to him. And Luma, for her part, seemed to thrive. She grew stronger by the day, her movements more coordinated, her responses sharper. She would giggle, a sound like tiny chimes, when Daniel made funny faces at her. And sometimes she would stare up at him with those deep violet eyes so intently that he felt as if she were studying him, memorizing his soul. Her differences, though undeniable, became part of her charm rather than a source of fear. The way her skin shifted slightly in hue depending on her mood, the faint pulse of bioluminescence that brightened when she was happy, the strange way her hair seemed to ripple with static energy when she was excited. Daniel kept a careful journal, noting every development, every anomaly, documenting her life with the precision of a scientist, but the heart of a father. Despite his efforts to keep their existence low profile, he knew he couldn't remain entirely isolated forever. He still had to make occasional trips into town for supplies, and though he became adept at shopping during the quietest hours, at dodging curious glances, he worried constantly about what would happen if anyone noticed Luma's unusual traits. To the casual observer, wrapped snugly in layers of fabric, she might pass for a slightly odd-looking human infant, but any prolonged scrutiny could unravel everything. So, Daniel prepared contingency plans, a false identity constructed through careful digital manipulation, a secure room hidden beneath the house accessible only through a biometric lock he installed, emergency escape routes mapped through the woods behind the property. It was paranoia, perhaps, but necessary. Too much was at stake. Late one night, after a particularly exhausting day filled with diaper disasters and formula experiments gone wrong, Daniel sat by the window, Luma nestled against his chest, her soft breath warming the crook of his neck. Outside, the mist was thick again, swirling lazily under the cold glow of the moon. He found himself humming, a tune from his childhood, something his mother used to sing, and Luma stirred, her tiny hand gripping his shirt with surprising strength. "I've got you, little one," he whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of her silken head. "No one's going to take you away. I promise." Promises were heavy things, Daniel realized, and they carried a weight even heavier when given to someone who had no choice but to trust you absolutely. Luma's entire existence now depended on him, her safety, her growth, her chance at life. And Daniel, despite his lingering self-doubt, knew he would rather die than break that promise. As days blurred into weeks, a new normalcy took root in Daniel's life. Mornings were filled with laughter, Luma's delighted squeals echoing through the house as Daniel played peekaboo or built elaborate towers of blocks just so she could giggle when he knocked them down. Afternoons were for lessons, not that Luma could understand much yet, but Daniel read to her anyway, everything from children's books to snippets of his old engineering manuals, letting the sound of his voice surround her with comfort and familiarity. Evenings were quiet, filled with long walks around the property, Luma strapped snugly against his chest, her wide eyes absorbing the world. The flutter of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the way the stars shimmered like broken glass scattered across the velvet sky. Daniel often found himself telling her stories on these walks, mythologies from ancient Earth, tales of heroes and lost civilizations, of voyages into the unknown, all the while wondering if someday he would have to tell her the story of her own origins, of the mother who had sacrificed everything, and the world she would never truly know. Yet beneath the daily rhythms, a tension simmered, an awareness that this fragile peace could not last forever. The pendant continued to glow faintly on the nightstand beside Luma's crib, its patterns shifting occasionally in ways Daniel could neither predict nor fully understand. Was it sending a signal? Receiving one? A beacon, perhaps, calling to those who might come looking, not all of whom, Daniel feared, would have Luma's best interests at heart. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake with his heart pounding, convinced he had heard something outside, the snap of a twig, the low hum of something unnatural in the air. But every time he checked, the woods remained empty. The night, silent but for the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Still, the fear gnawed at him, sharpening his instincts, keeping him perpetually on edge. He began teaching himself basic survival skills he had never needed before. How to spot surveillance drones, how to mask heat signatures, how to create distractions and traps if necessary. It was absurd in a way, a single man preparing to defend a child against enemies who might not even exist, but Daniel no longer cared about how it looked from the outside. All that mattered was Luma. And so the days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, and though the specter of discovery hung over them like a storm cloud, Daniel found himself increasingly wrapped up in the simple, breathtaking miracle of watching Luma grow. Her first smile, her first laugh, the first time she gripped his finger with deliberate intent, all milestones that filled Daniel with a fierce, almost unbearable pride. He filmed every moment on a secure, offline drive, documenting her journey in case someday she would want to know who she was, where she came from, and how deeply she was loved. One chilly autumn morning, as Daniel rocked Luma gently by the window, he noticed a new development. Her skin, usually a soft, muted silver, now shimmered with hints of pink and gold as the sunlight touched it, as if her body were learning to adapt, to blend more seamlessly with her surroundings. Hope flickered in Daniel's chest. Maybe, just maybe, Earth could be her home in more ways than one. Maybe she wouldn't always have to hide. Maybe someday she could walk among humans, not as an outcast or a curiosity, but simply as herself. The thought was a balm against the fears that never fully left him. Daniel smiled down at the sleeping child in his arms, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his own. "We'll figure it out," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "No matter what it takes, we'll figure it out." And with that quiet vow, Daniel Reed, once an ordinary man of ordinary dreams, stepped fully into the extraordinary, unknowable future that awaited him, a future bound to a tiny, silver-skinned girl who had fallen into his life like a blessing from the stars. It happened on a night so quiet that even the crickets seemed to hold their breath, a night cloaked in the kind of dense silver fog that muffled every sound and made the world outside Daniel Reed's home feel as though it had slipped into some other realm, a half-dreamed place where anything was possible, and everything, no matter how improbable, could come true or fall apart in an instant. Daniel had just finished settling Luma down to sleep, her tiny form nestled securely in her crib, her bioluminescent glow muted to a soft pulse that bathed the room in a halo of gentle light, and he was sitting by the window, cup of cold coffee in hand, watching the mist swirl in lazy hypnotic patterns under the pale eye of the moon, when he saw a shape emerge from the woods. A figure so still and silent, it might have been a hallucination conjured by the exhaustion weighing down his bones, but something inside him, some deep, primal instinct, honed sharp by months of vigilant fatherhood, recognized her immediately, even though every rational part of him screamed that it was impossible, even though he had half convinced himself she must have died or left this world altogether, because there, standing at the very edge of the mist, wrapped in a tattered cloak that hung heavy with dew, was the alien woman, Luma's mother, the one whose desperate, haunted eyes he had never been able to forget. Daniel froze, heart hammering painfully against his ribs, coffee forgotten and spilling onto the floor as he pressed his face to the cold window glass, unable to look away, and for a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. Then she stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, as if testing the solidity of the world beneath her bare feet, and Daniel sprang into action, racing to the door, throwing it open so hard it banged against the wall, the fog spilling inside like a living thing as he stumbled down the porch steps and into the mist, toward her, toward the impossible made real. Up close, she looked even more fragile than he remembered, her silver skin marred with scrapes and bruises, her golden eyes dimmed with exhaustion, but burning still with that fierce, aching love he had glimpsed the night she left her baby in. His arms. She swayed on her feet, and without thinking, Daniel caught her, his arms wrapping around her weightless frame, feeling the trembling of her body against his chest, as if she might dissolve into the mist at any moment. "You're alive," he whispered, the words catching painfully in his throat, and she made a sound, half sob, half sigh, that needed no translation. For a few seconds, they simply stood there, two souls bound together by the fragile thread of a child sleeping upstairs, by the impossible choice she had made, and the impossible promise he had kept. And then, slowly, painfully, she pulled back, just enough to meet his eyes, her hand brushing his cheek in a gesture so tender it almost undid him completely. Without words, she pleaded, and without words, Daniel understood. She needed to see her baby. Gently, almost reverently, he led her inside, closing the door softly against the night, as if afraid the mist might follow them and tear this fragile reunion apart, and together they climbed the stairs, Daniel's heart pounding so loudly he was sure it must be waking Luma even before they reached her door. Inside, the nursery was warm and peaceful, filled with the soft, rhythmic sound of the baby's breathing, and Daniel stepped aside, allowing the woman, Aria, the name slipped into his mind so naturally it had to be right, to cross the threshold, alone. She moved like a ghost, weightless and silent, her eyes locked on the tiny bundle nestled amid soft blankets, and as she reached the crib, she sank to her knees, a sound like a broken prayer escaping her lips as she pressed her forehead to the edge of the crib, trembling with the force of 100 bottled emotions. Daniel stood back, watching with a lump in his throat the size of a fist, feeling like an intruder on something sacred, but unwilling to leave, unwilling to abandon her now that she had found her way back. Slowly, Arya reached into the crib, her fingers brushing the downy softness of Luma's hair, and the baby stirred, letting out a tiny sigh but not waking, as if some part of her too recognized the presence she had been born to but torn away from too soon. Tears streamed silently down Arya's cheeks, glowing faintly under the soft light of her skin, and Daniel, moved beyond words, crossed the room and knelt beside her, offering what little comfort he could with the silent strength of his presence. Minutes or hours passed, time becoming a meaningless thing as the three of them remained there, woven together by a bond stronger than fear, stronger than logic, until at last Arya turned to him, her golden eyes fierce and pleading, and spoke, in a voice barely more than a breath. "Thank you." Daniel shook his head, swallowing hard. "You don't have to thank me," he said, voice rough with emotion. She's my daughter too now." The words, once terrifying in their implication, now settled easily on his tongue, a truth he had lived and breathed every day since Luma entered his life. Arya's eyes softened, her hand reaching out to clasp his in a grip so strong it surprised him. A silent acknowledgement of the trust, the gratitude, the shared devotion that now bound them all. They sat together until the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the window, and only then did Arya rise, her movements slow and stiff, exhaustion etched into every line of her body. Daniel helped her downstairs, settling her onto the couch with a blanket and a glass of water, and while she rested, he finally allowed himself to breathe, to process the impossible reality now unfolding before him. Over the next few days, a new rhythm began to emerge, awkward at first, fragile, like a newborn fawn finding its legs, but growing stronger with each passing hour. Arya spoke little, her command of English fragmented but improving rapidly, aided by the pendant she still wore around her neck, which pulsed softly whenever she struggled for a word or phrase, offering translations or gentle corrections in tones Daniel couldn't always hear. Through gestures, halting sentences and shared glances, Daniel pieced together fragments of her story. The crash landing far from any human eyes, the desperate search for safe refuge, the terrible realization that Earth's atmosphere was slowly poisoning her, and the agonizing decision to leave her child with someone who might save her when she no longer could.
She had survived against all odds, hiding in the dense wilderness, scavenging what little sustenance she could find, her body weakening day by day until at last, sensing death's approach, she had gathered her remaining strength to find her.
Way back here to see her child one last time, or to die trying. But now, against every odd, she was alive. And Daniel, watching her cradle Luma with tears streaming down her face, knew there was no way he could let her slip away again. She needed help, medical attention he could not provide. But going to any hospital was out of the question. Her differences, subtle though they might be, would trigger immediate suspicion, investigation, and possibly far worse. So Daniel did what he did best. He adapted, he improvised, he fought for those he loved. He ordered supplies under false names, using encrypted networks he hadn't touched since his reckless college days. He consulted obscure medical texts, patching together a regimen of vitamins, minerals, and carefully calibrated environmental controls to ease the strain on Arya's damaged body. Slowly, painfully, she began to heal. Not fully, perhaps not permanently, but enough to stand without trembling, enough to laugh. A soft, broken sound that Daniel treasured more than he could say, when Luma babbled nonsense words at her with the fierce insistence of a baby determined to be understood. And through it all, something unspoken began to grow between Daniel and Arya, something delicate and terrifying and achingly real. A connection born not just of shared duty, but of shared hope, shared grief, shared fierce, protective love for the tiny, miraculous being who had brought them together. It was in the small moments that Daniel felt it most. The way Arya's hand would brush his as they passed Luma between them. The way her gaze would linger on him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way his heart leapt painfully every time she smiled. He didn't know what the future held, whether Arya's health would hold, whether Luma could ever live openly in a world not built for her kind, whether the tenuous, precious thing growing between them could survive the trials that surely lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel Reed wasn't afraid. He had found his purpose, his family, his heart, and he would protect them with everything he had, no matter what came next. Weeks blended into months, and what had first felt like a fragile miracle slowly, steadily, solidified into a life, an existence stitched together from quiet mornings, stolen smiles, whispered laughter, and the steady, ever-burning flame of determination that Daniel and Arya carried between them. A promise made wordlessly every time their eyes met across the room, every time they cradled Luma between them and felt her tiny heart beating with a force that defied the stars themselves. And in that hidden corner of the world, wrapped in layers of forest and fog, shielded from prying eyes by nothing more than luck, caution, and the fierce, unyielding love that now bound them all, a new family was born, not from blood or tradition, but from choice, from sacrifice, from the aching beauty of two souls who had found each other against every conceivable odd. Life settled into a rhythm. As Daniel adapted his work, moving entirely remote, faking new identities when necessary, learning to navigate the hidden corners of the human world with the precision of a ghost, and Arya, ever watchful, ever learning, grew stronger, her silver skin gaining a healthier sheen, her eyes regaining the quiet, regal fire that spoke of the life she had once known and the battles she had fought to protect it. And as she grew more comfortable, she began to infuse their small home with pieces of herself, strange symbols etched delicately into the wooden frames of doors and windows, small, iridescent stones placed at corners and thresholds, creating a subtle barrier of protection that Daniel could feel, even if he could not see its full power. And the house, once an ordinary place, now thrummed with a kind of living magic, a sanctuary woven from love and fear and hope. Luma flourished in this hidden world, her first steps taken across the worn floorboards of Daniel's living room, her first words, half English, half melodic alien sounds, spilling from her lips in a babble that made Arya weep with joy, and Daniel laughed with a pride so fierce it felt like it might tear him apart, and though the world outside their cocoon remained a constant, looming threat, for a time it seemed as though they had outrun it, as though maybe, just maybe, the universe had forgotten them, had granted them this narrow, precious reprieve. But safety, Daniel knew, was an illusion, a fragile thing that could shatter with the slightest pressure. And late one night, as a cold wind howled through the trees and the mist pressed heavy against the windows like a living thing, that illusion crumbled. It began with a sound, a low rhythmic hum, barely perceptible beneath the wind's mournful cry. But Daniel's instincts, honed sharp by months of vigilance, caught it instantly, dragging him from sleep with a jolt of adrenaline that set every nerve ablaze. He slipped from bed, careful not to wake Arya, who lay curled against him with Luma nestled between them, and padded silently to the window, heart hammering against his ribs. And there, beyond the tree line, he saw it. A pale blue light sweeping through the mist, deliberate, methodical, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Someone was searching. Fear slammed into Daniel like a fist, but he forced it down, breathing slow, measured breaths as he crossed the room to the hidden panel he had built months ago, revealing the emergency supplies he had prepared in grim anticipation of this day. A bug-out bag stuffed with essentials, cash, false IDs, portable heaters, formula for Luma, clothes for Arya. He grabbed it with shaking hands, slinging it over his shoulder before returning to the bed, gently shaking Arya awake. She came to consciousness instantly, her instincts as finely tuned as his own, and without a word, she scooped Luma into her arms, clutching her close as Daniel led them through the hidden back door, out into the cold, suffocating mist. They moved like shadows, swift and silent, slipping between trees, avoiding patches of open ground, hearts pounding in synchrony as the lights swept closer, cutting across the place they had called home with ruthless precision. Daniel didn't know who was out there, government agents, private mercenaries, something worse, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was getting Arya and Luma to safety. They made it to the old service road half a mile from the house, where Daniel had stashed a battered SUV under a tarp months earlier, and they piled in, Daniel gunning the engine with a prayer, and a snarl, tires kicking up mud as they barreled down the dirt road toward whatever slim hope awaited them beyond the trees. Hours blurred into one another, endless miles of back roads and abandoned highways. Arya huddled in the back seat with Luma cradled against her chest, singing low, haunting melodies that Daniel didn't understand, but that somehow wrapped around his heart and steadied his shaking hands on the wheel. Finally, when the sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon in a wash of pale gold, Daniel pulled into a crumbling, long-abandoned gas station, tucked between two hills, hidden from the main road by overgrown brush and skeletal trees. It was here he had stashed their second safe house, a crumbling cabin reinforced with whatever materials he could scavenge, a place so remote and unremarkable that it might just be invisible. Inside, the air was musty and cold, but Daniel moved, quickly, lighting the old wood stove, checking the generators, setting up the environmental controls Arya needed to breathe comfortably. By the time Luma woke, blinking up at them with wide, curious eyes, the cabin was warm, and for a brief, shining moment, it almost felt like home again. But the danger had not passed. Whoever had found their first home would not stop. They would comb the forests, scour the towns, and if they ever got close enough to see Arya's luminous skin or Luma's impossible golden eyes, it would be over. Daniel and Arya both knew it. Over the following days, they lived on high alert. Every sound, outside a potential threat, every moment of peace tinged with the metallic taste of fear. And yet, even in the midst of it, life found a way to cling to them, to bloom. Daniel watched as Arya taught Luma words from her native tongue, the sounds strange and beautiful in the small space, and he marveled at the way their daughter straddled two worlds with a grace he could only aspire to. He caught Arya watching him sometimes, a complicated look in her golden eyes, and though the words remained unspoken between them, Daniel knew she saw what he felt. This fierce, undeniable love, this devotion that went beyond mere survival. It was one night, as a storm raged outside, rattling the shutters and howling against the roof, that Arya finally spoke the words that had been growing between them for so long, her voice a whisper barely louder than the crackle of the fire. "You are my home." Daniel closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, pulling her into his arms, feeling the way her body fit against his like it had always been meant to. And when he kissed her, it was not the desperate, frantic kiss of fear or loneliness, but something deeper, steadier, a merging of souls long separated by stars and fate, finally reunited in the most impossible corner of the universe. From that moment on, they stopped pretending. They were a family in every way that mattered. Together, they built something new in that battered cabin, a life filled with whispered secrets, shared dreams, and the ever-present knowledge that the world outside might never understand, might never accept what they were or what they had. But it didn't matter. They had each other. They had Luma. And for Daniel Reed, once just an ordinary man with an ordinary life, that was more than enough. It was everything.